The sea stretched endlessly beneath a crimson sky, its calm surface belying the tension simmering in the steel guts of the USS Thomas Hudner, a U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer patrolling the Red Sea. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, but even beneath layers of protocol and discipline, a chill had settled in the corridors. Part instinct, part experience. Everyone aboard knew the waters weren't safe anymore. They hadn't been for months. Commander Rachel Donovan stood on the bridge, eyes scanning the horizon through reinforced glass. A decade of deployments had etched a quiet authority into her posture. She wasn't one for dramatics, but even she had to admit, this mission was different. Not because of the location, though the Bab el-Mandeb Strait had always been volatile, but because this time they weren't hunting pirates or deterring smugglers. They were hunting silence. A silence filled with the distant promise of drones, missiles, and a new kind of warfare. To the untrained eye, the Houthis might seem like a ragtag insurgent group tucked away in Yemen's rugged mountains, far removed from the precision and power of the U.S. Navy. But Donovan had read the briefings, the intercepted transmissions, the assessments buried under layers of Pentagon caution. The Houthis had evolved. With Iranian backing, they had transformed from local rebels into strategic players, armed with ballistic missiles, weaponized drones, and an unflinching ideological zeal. They had already targeted Saudi tankers and even fired upon U.S. warships in past years. Each attack had grown bolder, more coordinated, and now they were aiming higher. Petty Officer Malik Reyes sat at his station below deck, running diagnostic sweeps of the ship's missile defense systems. He was young, but already seasoned. He'd been aboard when they intercepted a Houthi drone 2 weeks earlier. That one had come in low, trying to mimic a seagull's radar signature. It would have worked too, if not for a last-second course correction that tipped the AI sensors. The drone exploded harmlessly over the water, but the message had been clear. We're watching. We're learning. Reyes had grown up believing the enemy was a uniformed soldier with a flag and a name. Now it was a flash on a radar screen, a sound without a source, a warning that never came. Back on the bridge, Donovan watched as a lone cargo ship passed off their port side, its path unsteady. The merchant vessels were becoming skittish, rerouting through longer paths around Africa, losing millions in delayed trade. The Red Sea had become a war zone without front lines, where every fishing boat could be a disguise, every blip on sonar a death sentence, and the Navy had been tasked with keeping order in a place that no longer followed the old rules. Her XO, Lieutenant Commander Jacob Bell, approached with a tablet in hand. "New satellite feed just came in," he said, tapping the screen. "Thermal signatures in western Yemen. Looks like mobile launch platforms, but too far inland for immediate threat." Donovan frowned. Too far now. Not too far forever. She had no illusions about the political games surrounding their presence. Washington wanted strength without escalation, a show of dominance that didn't invite retaliation. But the Houthis didn't play by deterrence theory. They didn't fear overwhelming firepower. They calculated in martyrdom and symbolism. One well-placed strike on a U.S. warship, especially one with a female commander, a diverse crew, headlines waiting to be written, could shake public confidence back home and embolden others abroad. The quiet was pierced by a low alarm from the radar station. "Commander, we've got an anomalous signal. Could be civilian, but it's running dark. No AIS, no transponder," said Ensign Huang, barely lifting her eyes from the console. Her voice was calm, but the tension had returned, sharpening every movement on the bridge. Donovan moved behind her. "Heading? Southwest, slow vector, about 25 nautical miles out. Low radar signature. Send out the Seahawk, eyes on target, keep CIWS in standby," she ordered. Minutes later, the deck roared to life as the MH-60R helicopter lifted off into the early evening haze, cutting across the orange-drenched water. Donovan remained on the bridge, not moving, barely blinking. Every minute dragged like a tightrope walk. There was always a first signal before something worse. Always a test. Reyes, monitoring the feed below, adjusted his headset. "They're checking our reaction time," he muttered, mostly to himself, "seeing if we're asleep at the wheel." But no one on the Thomas Hudner was asleep. Not anymore. The helicopter relayed visuals, an old dhow, hull rusting, nets piled high. Harmless, except for what it wasn't saying. "No heat signatures. Looks abandoned," the pilot reported. Or maybe not. Donovan felt it, the prickling certainty. This wasn't the attack. This was the whisper before the storm. "All right," she said, stepping forward. "We mark it. Keep it on scope, but bring the bird back." There would be more tests, more decoys, and eventually, a strike that wasn't meant to test, but to kill. As night fell, the ship's silhouette merged with the dark waters, a quiet leviathan in a sea of ghosts. Below decks, Reyes finished his diagnostics, his fingers hovering over the system's final report. All green. For now. On the bridge, Donovan allowed herself a brief moment of silence. Then she spoke, not loudly, but enough for her officers to hear. "They're not just aiming at us. They're aiming at the idea of us." No one responded. They didn't need to. The attack didn't come with a scream, but with silence, the kind that tightened throats and made the hair on the back of the neck rise. It was 3:17 local time, and the USS Thomas Hudner rode the darkness like a wolf among shadows. The crew had been rotating through midnight watches in uneasy cycles, the tension humming through bulkheads and into bones. Commander Rachel Donovan hadn't slept. She stood on the bridge, lit only by faint red emergency lighting, staring into a sea that refused to blink. Then it began. Petty Officer Malik Reyes was the first to see it, not with his eyes, but through the flicker of an anomalous heat trail stitched across his monitor, a shape moving faster than a commercial jet, flying low and wrong, trailing no known signature. His fingers stilled above the keyboard, heart hammering like a fist against his ribs. "Possible incoming. Missile. Bearing 170. Confirming trajectory," he said aloud, and his voice cracked the quiet like a warning bell from some ancient cathedral. Alarms erupted. The bridge transformed in an instant. Dark to firelit, calm to combat. Every officer moved in concert, drilled into reaction, but the stakes changed everything. Ensign Huang began calling out intercept data, eyes dancing across 5 screens at once. "High-altitude launch, descending arc, ballistic profile, impact vector 26 seconds. Donovan stepped forward, the ship's fire control officer already launching intercepts. "VLS cells hot. 2 SM-2s airborne." Outside, the destroyer exhaled war. Twin missiles shot skyward, curving into the night with the fury of ancient gods, their contrails vanishing into blackness. And still, another threat arrived. "Second launch detected. 2 more missiles. Closer origin. Separate vectors. Low altitude. Cruise class," Huang reported. "Plus unknown drone signature from southeast." "They're saturating us," Bell muttered. "Testing our layers." "No," Donovan corrected, eyes hardening. "They're not testing. They're aiming to breach." In the Combat Information Center, Reyes rerouted targeting protocols, toggling to manual override. The Aegis system was good, near infallible, but there were moments where instinct outpaced automation. He trusted the system, but more than that, he trusted the people manning it. The ship lurched slightly. SM-2 intercept confirmed. 1 ballistic missile gone, debris harmlessly scattering over empty water. But the second missile wasn't so cooperative. It broke into a chaotic dive, its final descent erratic, confused by jamming and countermeasures. "CIWS tracking," Huang called. "Engaging." The Phalanx close-in weapon system roared to life, a furious blur of noise and light, spewing tungsten at 4,500 rounds per minute. A second later, a thunderclap shook the air. "Impact!" Reyes shouted. "That was close! Proximity blast!" The ship shuddered but didn't falter. Damage reports poured in. Some outer hull stress, radar echo disrupted, a forward comms relay briefly knocked out. No fires, no breaches. "Third missile still active," Huang said. "Low approach, skimming the water." Donovan was already ordering counterfire. "Second volley, use ESSMS. Bring the drone down first. Priority." The drone closed in fast, smaller, harder to track, hugging the radar blind spots. This one wasn't surveillance. It had a nose painted black and a small red crescent. It was meant to die. Reyes's screen flashed yellow, then green. "Drone neutralized. Splash 1. "Missile?" Donovan asked. "On final approach." CIWS turned again. The last line of defense opened fire once more. Another explosion rocked the ship, louder, closer. Smoke curled into the air from the aft section. Systems flickered. Bulkheads groaned. "Minor hull breach," Bell announced. "Auxiliary power holding. Engineering crew dispatched." Donovan didn't flinch. "Casualties?" 2 reported injured. "Shrapnel, nothing critical. Med teams en route." On the horizon, the faint orange streaks of missile launches no longer glowed. The sea had returned to its unnatural stillness. But they weren't finished yet. Huang spoke again, her voice sharper this time. "We've got surface contact. Fast boat inbound, moving erratically, no transponder." "Gun crews to stations," Donovan said. "Bring up the Seahawk. Engage from the air." From the flight deck, the MH-60R helicopter rose quickly, angling toward the threat. The fast boat, a skiff packed with explosives, moved like a shark, weaving across the waves. Its pilot was invisible but not aimless. He was coming straight for the ship. The Seahawk's Hellfire missile ended at mid-dash. A fireball tore through the dark, raining fragments into the sea. Reyes let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Threats neutralized," Huang confirmed. Donovan stared at the empty water, her jaw set. "We were supposed to be invisible out here, untouchable." Bell glanced at her. "They didn't hit us. Not really." "They hit the idea of us," she replied. "That's the message." Below deck, Reyes finally leaned back, letting the hum of the monitors steady his pulse. His hands were slick with sweat. It had all lasted just over 7 minutes. 7 minutes that stretched between silence and survival. The ship limped back into operational calm. Damage control teams patched wiring, reinforced bulkheads, sealed smoke-filled chambers. The crew worked quietly, without need for speeches or high words. They knew what had almost happened, and what could come next. In the command center, Donovan looked at the sky beyond the glass. 1,000 stars watched, unmoved. The enemy had fired everything it could without a declaration of war. The line had been crossed, and yet no one would call it that. Not yet. The headlines tomorrow would mention the successful defense, the bravery of the crew, the proof of deterrence. But they all knew it wasn't over. This had only been the beginning. Dawn arrived reluctantly, painting the Red Sea in faint gold, as if even the sun hesitated to cast light on what had transpired. The USS Thomas Hudner cut through the water at reduced speed, her hull scarred but proud. She'd survived, but survival wasn't the same as victory. Commander Rachel Donovan stood at the forward deck rail, the ocean wind tugging at her uniform, eyes fixed on the distant Yemeni coast. Somewhere beyond those hills, the men who had tried to kill her crew were likely already preparing the next launch. Below deck, Petty Officer Malik Reyes sat beside a dented bulkhead near the auxiliary comms panel. His hands, wrapped in fresh gauze, trembled slightly from the heat flash he'd absorbed during the drone strike. The medic had said he'd be fine. Reyes wasn't so sure, not because of the wounds, those would heal, but because he couldn't shake the sound. The moment the second missile struck nearby, the ship had groaned like a wounded animal. For a split second, he thought they'd be swallowed whole. In the operations center, Lieutenant Commander Bell was sifting through the first debrief with intelligence officers via satellite uplink. They were talking targets, retribution. Drones were already airborne, skimming the coastline, snapping thermal images of suspected Houthi launch zones. Every flash of heat, every metallic shape hidden beneath camouflaged netting was being tagged for the next phase. The retaliation wasn't a question. It was a script already written, waiting for approval. Donovan stepped inside the briefing room just as Bell signed off the uplink. His face, usually unreadable, looked heavier somehow. "They're saying we held the line," he told her, voice flat. "That we proved deterrence works." She gave a short, humorless breath. "It wasn't deterrence. It was defense. There's a difference." Bell nodded, but said nothing. They both knew that Washington would want a clean narrative. Precision, resolve, professionalism. The public didn't like ambiguity, but ambiguity was all they had out here. Asymmetric war had no neat endings. By noon, orders came in. Limited retaliatory strikes authorized. Targets prioritized. A radar installation near Mocha, a suspected missile depot camouflaged inside an abandoned village compound, and a command relay antenna buried in the cliffs. F-18s launched from the carrier Eisenhower farther north, their engines tearing across the sky like warnings from Olympus. Reyes watched the footage hours later, grainy infrared bursts on a replay loop. The buildings vanished in heat and smoke. It should have felt like justice. It didn't. Not really. Aboard the Thomas Hudner, damage control teams finished their work. Panels replaced, systems restored, bodies unbroken, spirits bruised but upright. Yet the crew moved with the brittle silence of people who had glimpsed something close, something final. Later, Donovan convened a closed-door gathering with her senior officers. No script, no performance, just truth. "They threw everything they had at us," she said, "and we stopped it. But we can't mistake survival for invulnerability. They're getting smarter, more precise. This wasn't just an attack. It was a message." Bell leaned forward. "Then what do we send back?" Donovan's gaze swept the room. "That we're not afraid to stay." It wasn't applause that followed, but a silent nod of collective agreement. Fear was present, but it was no longer in. Command. That evening, a global news feed ran footage of the strike aftermath. Blackened wreckage, plumes rising from distant hills. Officials spoke of precision and professionalism, of measured response. Back home, senators and spokespeople lauded the crew's heroism. Words like resilience and resolve floated across headlines. None of that captured the weight of it. None showed the moment before impact, the breath before fire. The Hudner remained on station, joined by another destroyer 2 days later. Their radar coverage expanded. Patrol zones rotated tighter. The sea had grown quieter, but it was the kind of quiet that vibrated with potential energy. The enemy wasn't beaten, only paused. Reyes stood on the deck the following night, alone beneath the stars, the wind brushing his bruised hands. He watched the sea and thought about how close they had come to being another headline, another name etched on a wall. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't at peace either. Donovan approached without speaking. She simply stood beside him, hands behind her back. "You ever wonder what they think on the other side?" he asked quietly. "All the time," she said, "but it doesn't change what we have to do." The waves lapped gently against the hull. The night stretched wide. They stood in silence a moment longer, two figures alone in a sea that had forgotten the rules, watching the dark, waiting for what came next.